What's that saying I always say to you about your deliverables? Oh, done. Okay, done is better than perfect. Go grab a coffee, a tea, some water, and get cozy, because we've got another episode of Work Bestie Business coming at you with a great topic today. One that many of us will experience or have experienced or are experiencing at work right now. It's difficult coworkers. How to deal with them, how to identify them, some tips and tricks for just getting through the day with as little interaction with these people as possible and trying to make it a positive experience, all right? Dealing with difficult coworkers. Let's get into it, shall we? I'm gonna get comfortable for this one. So let's start it off by identifying different types of challenging coworkers so that we can have our approach to dealing with them be a little bit more curated and hopefully more effective in your situation. The first one being the slackers. We've all dealt with that coworker. Well, I assume we've all dealt. If you haven't, that's great. But we've all dealt with that coworker that at the end of the day, they're delegating and delegating and delegating or just deflecting all the work. And when you sit down and think about it, other than delegating, you're like, what have they contributed here? What is their job? I remember a couple coworkers in particular I think back to, and I still couldn't tell you what they did, if anything, the whole time I was there. So these coworkers tend to be more unmotivated, a little bit more lazy. They do less than the bare minimum, because the bare minimum is just like doing your job description. They get away from all responsibilities. They find a way to kind of wiggle themselves out of a lot of the workload. They procrastinate when they are expected to do something. Minimal contributions to team effort. They're kind of like that dead weight in the group that you're just kind of like in a group project. You're like, well, I'm not going to assign them anything because I know they're not going to do it, and I'm going to end up doing it at the end of the day anyway. So they're there. They get the mark, but we did all the work. Those kind of coworkers. So how do we deal with them? Well, we try not to get too frustrated first and foremost, because you can't change other people. And as much as you wish you can try to control that situation, or you wish that they would do the thing that you're wanting them to do, you don't have control over other people. And so you just have to accept that. Some things that we can do to try to deal with it, if we will, is understand their goals and help them make progress towards them. So this is more if you are the manager position with that coworker or with that employee. I would say, make time to understand from them what their goals are, create that action plan alongside with them, and understand a little bit more how they're seeing the general scope of things, how they're seeing the picture and where they're trying to go from here, just to see if maybe there's something that you're missing. Maybe what they're doing or the work is just really misaligned and they want to do something else. It starts to open the conversation at a minimum. If you're the manager dealing with this employee, we want to give positive feedback when there is something that they've done that we are like, we need to see more of that. So, that positive kind of reinforcement. If they do accomplish something or they do produce something, acknowledge them for that. I think sometimes externally we can see coworkers as slackers, as lazy, as unmotivated. There might be something else going on there that you're not seeing or is not available to you to see. There actually might be a bigger root issue than them just being a slacker in general. Yes, there are those people that they're just slackers and they're just trying to get by doing as little as possible. But then there's some other people that are dealing with roadblocks or obstacles that are really challenging to work through. When we are seeing the behavior that we want to see continue within them, acknowledge it, appreciate it, recognize it so that they know, like, oh yeah, this is what they must want me to do. And it kind of keeps potentially that ball rolling a little bit. Encourage them to participate and share their ideas as much as possible. So if you're in a meeting and they're just kind of sitting out looking like they just don't want to be involved, don't want to do anything, bring them into the discussion or create space for them in the discussion of, hey, coworker, what are your thoughts on this? Have you dealt with something like this? What's your experience? We'd love your input, to try to include them a little bit more into the conversation and at least give them the opportunity to contribute something to the conversations that you're having. Again, this is a lot from like a manager role, but just providing them with any of the resources that they need to complete the task. Maybe doing a check-in of like, is there anything additional you need in order to complete these things, of resources, of systems, of software, whatever it might be, but giving the opportunity for them to tell you, yes, I need something. No, I don't need anything else, that might enable them to do a bit of a better job or set them up for success a little bit more. Establish a supportive or just regular check-ins. As much as micromanaging can be really deterring to a lot of people, or it can be really damaging to a lot of people's workflow, I think when we're dealing with people who externally are appearing more like they're slacking or lazy or unmotivated, having regular check-ins and giving very specific deadlines might help them manage workload more, or give them more of a direction and path to follow so that they're meeting the goals that you're setting up for them as as well. So regular check-ins to kind of say, okay, what are you working on right now? How are we targeting these goals, or how are we moving towards them, or what's the update status on it? However you want to structure them, but I think having a little bit more oversight to them, especially if you're someone managing a team and you're noticing that potentially there might be a member not contributing as much, you want to address that for their benefit, but also for the full team's benefit, so that if another team member comes to you and displays frustration for coworkers' lack of input or contributions, you're kind of able to speak to having a plan already in place, or having regular check-ins and having more exposure to their process and contribution, so that nothing's catching you off guard of like, oh, I didn't even realize they weren't doing anything. What do you mean? They're like, you're already kind of ahead of it. That's how I would deal with a slacker. These might be one of the most controversial ones, but they're the gossipers. And on one hand, it's like, oh, you love to hear a good office rumor. But on the other hand, the gossipers can be so damaging to team dynamics. They can make for a very unhealthy work environment. I'm watching like the OC right now, or not the OC, selling the OC. I just cannot imagine. Maybe I've never worked in an environment with that much drama, and I know a lot of it's for the reality TV element of it, but anytime I'm watching these shows that are set in a workplace environment, like any of these, like Selling Sunset, Selling OC, I cannot imagine working in an environment like that, because there is no line between personal and work life, and your personal information, like very detailed, intimate parts of your life, are getting exposed in these working environments, and it does not lead to a healthy work environment. It leads to a lot of isolation and segregation, a lot of politics, and like behind the back. I know it's for TV, and you're probably like, Laura, like it's fine, it's TV. But it's also life. And anyways, so the gossipers, they can really create, I guess my point here is they can really create a damaging work environment for a lot of people. If you do come across a gossiper, be mindful of how much you're willing to engage, or be intentional with it. If you also want to be a gossiper, I mean, that's your decision. Just keep that in mind of what repercussions might come with that, but just acknowledging when people kind of are gossiping and maybe they're trying to use you or bring you into it, you can shut that down right away. Say, hey, I'm not interested in speaking about that. Let's get back to the agenda. Or, oh, I'm not interested in hearing about so-and-so's personal life, or just not engaging with it and shutting it down. We'll make sure that they don't come back to you as a source of gossiping to kind of pull you into the group. Shutting it down right away is a very strong approach to that one. You know, if you're also managing a team with a lot of gossipers, it's important to, anything that's been brought to your attention that can impact your team, employees, just like the work-life dynamic in general, setting aside time to speak to those, to kind of open up dialogue and set the record straight on things, not in a sense of like, is this rumor true, but in the sense of what is acceptable to bring into the workplace and what is not acceptable, and kind of getting ahead of that before it goes out of control. Oftentimes when managers take a step back and they're like, yeah, I don't want to get involved in that, it just allows it to build and build and build and build so much more. And it kind of shows a lack of, I don't know if it's professionalism or confidence or lack of respect, really, when a manager, like, they know about it, but they just don't want to deal with it or don't want to address it. And people be like, well, I don't get paid to deal with people's drama. It's like, no, but you get paid to manage teams, and this is a big part of managing teams. So you want to make sure that you're kind of nipping it in the bud as soon as possible, as soon as it's brought to your attention, and then doing any damage control on that, really. Keeping the conversation on track, I think, when people, like I said, kind of shutting it down. So when people start to stray and maybe a little office gossip comes in, just go right back to the agenda. Just come right back, okay, well, we're discussing this. Like, just don't create space for it. Avoiding oversharing when they're present. There's the coworkers that you just know that they're a little bit more chatty. They could have the best intentions, and gossiping doesn't always have to come with like an ill intention or speaking bad. It could just be information sharing. But when people are in the room or in the meeting that are more likely to share personal information and kind of release information as if it's normal chatter, just be mindful about what you're sharing with them, and understanding that what you're sharing with others might be released to others and others and others. So just, you know, for the oversharers out there, maybe like a little note on your laptop, know when to stop, or like, don't overshare. Just something that might help you be like, oh, yeah, maybe I'm releasing too much to my coworkers. You have to kind of decide for yourself, though, where that threshold is of how much you're willing to release about your personal life. The gossipers are in in the conversation, I say just err on the side of caution, you know? And the last one I would say here is maybe like appeal to the empathy of it. So encourage them not to talk about people, or ask them, you know, why are you so interested in so-and-so's life? Or maybe you don't want to keep having the conversation, so a question's not the answer for that, but kind of saying, you know, I'm not interested in speaking about so-and-so when they're not in the room, or so-and-so's personal life is actually of no interest or business of mine. Kind of shutting down them bringing you into the gossip while also addressing and calling out what they're doing. It shows people in the room, or gives people an opportunity to kind of ask themselves, yeah, why do I care about this so much? Or yeah, it is disrespectful to speak about someone when they're not in the room. So kind of calling out that behavior in a semi like respectful professional way can do a lot, I think, in terms of shutting that down, but also giving that person an opportunity to realize what they're doing. Because sometimes I think people don't necessarily take that time to sit back and go like, why do I care about this so much? So maybe giving them an opportunity to be like, here's a little thought nugget for you. Go on and gossip about that kind of thing. Those would be the gossipers. The next one are the complainers, like the chronic complainers, the ones that just nothing can go right in their life. They're constantly complaining about everything. You know, it's always making things very negative, very pessimistic. They're just unpleasant to be around. They're like draining. They're those like energy suckers. You know, sometimes when you hang out with people and they add to your cup and you leave that interaction feeling maybe like socially drained, but you feel full in the sense of interaction and just motivation. Like, I don't know, like just make you feel full. And then there's those other people that you're like, I feel like you are sucking the life out of me. You almost need to limit how much time you spend with them because you already almost running on empty and they're just like draining you dry of every last drop. That's what the complainers kind of do. It's someone that if they were to ever say something positive, the whole room, you'd hear a pin drop. Everyone would be like, did you say something positive? Like, it's the person who kind of goes to the next extreme with their complaining. How to deal with them? We're not therapists at the end of the day. I think there needs to be a distinction kind of drawn there, because yes, you need to listen to them. You don't need to listen to them. You can listen to them. Sometimes it's important to listen to them because the criticisms that they're bringing to the table, they might be legitimate problems, especially when it comes to the business, or things that they're calling out or criticisms that are really relevant to whatever you're working on. There might be some validity in what they're saying. I would kind of pose it to them of like, you know, it's really important that we identify these issues, so thank you. It's also really important that, you know, we come to the table with solutions as well. So potentially in the future, when you're bringing us, you know, these criticisms, perhaps being able to offer a solution as well, at least to start the conversation, would be really helpful in addressing this issue. So encouraging people to not just focus on the negatives, especially when it comes to work, but identifying issues and then also coming to the table with solutions can be really powerful. I think too, a big thing is when things get overwhelmingly negative, or you're dealing with the complainers, or work's just not going really well, or the project is going really rough, it's important to take the space or the time, especially with teams, to understand or pull out the positives, the good takeaways, you know, the silver linings, if you will, of what has come from whatever this unfortunate series of events is. You know, I know in the past when I've worked on big projects and things just, you know, didn't go the way that we had hoped, or there was a big issue. It's, yeah, well, this big issue happened, but the way that we were able to respond or the learnings that came out of it. So taking the time to always highlight the positives as well within those situations, and especially encouraging those that are more likely to complain to identify something positive, kind of just starts to play with the brain a little bit more, to go, okay, well, maybe within this big pot of negative soup, there's actually a couple good things we can take away from it. So maybe over time, it starts to impact the way that we're thinking or the way that we're approaching things, or not just getting so caught up in the negative, because that's really easy to do. And then the last one here, I would just say, if this person is just so draining to be around and they are just so negative all the time, avoid them as much as possible. You don't have to interact with them any more than what's required for you to successfully do your job. Steer clear of them. I know those people in the past that I'm like, there's no helping you. There's nothing I can do to make you a more enjoyable person to be around for me. So I'm just gonna limit my interactions so that you aren't just sucking me dry and I'm not becoming that negative person too, because energy feeds off of energy. And so the more that we're surrounding ourselves with these people, it starts to rub off on you at a certain point. And yes, you can try to be the opposite and rub off on them and be really positive and whatnot. You want to make sure you're also protecting yourself over time. So understanding when you need to kind of just limit, avoid that person altogether for your own sanity or your own ability to show up and successfully do your job. Establishing kind of where that boundary is and kind of what your threshold for that is. very important when we're dealing with the complainers. And then we get to the oh so famous micromanagers, which in many, many cases, I know there's some exceptions to this, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Micromanagers can be really, really challenging to work with, especially if you're someone who really appreciates autonomy within your role, which I know many of us do. Having a micromanager and just that lack of trust and that constant hovering is not only really inefficient, like you spend so much of your time just kind of appealing to this micromanager and answering their questions and doing check-ins with them that you don't actually have a lot of time to do the work itself. It's exhausting over time dealing with a micromanager. So they're controlling, they're really hands-on, they check in constantly and constantly want to check your work, ask for updates really frequently, unrealistic timelines. They think they always know what's best for the most part. They want things done their way. It's like that whole argument of like, that's just how it's done, we've always done it this way, like don't mess with a good thing and blah, blah, blah. Micromanagers also struggle to delegate. They're really far into the weeds, especially we're talking about managers, so really far into the weeds on all of the activities within their team. They need to know everything constantly, and this can be quite exhausting, not just for the employees, but also the micromanager themselves. Like, I'm like, how are you not tired? You're exhausting to me. How are you not burnt out yet? Because you just are so involved with so many things. You know, and if you are a micromanager too, a lot of micromanagers don't necessarily realize they're micromanagers. And once they do realize they're micromanagers, they have a really hard time pulling back. Like they don't necessarily do it because it's a choice of like, I'm gonna show up today and be a micromanager. There's probably so many different things that contribute to it overall, but I think it can be really hard for people who are micromanagers to scale back and say, okay, I need to release this. I need to trust my teams and trust that we have the right people in place, that I don't need to be so far into the weeds here and I can focus on bigger picture items or items, tasks that are more specific to my role as the manager and kind of scale back. Encourage micromanagers to do so if that's something that they're working on. But if you are dealing with a micromanager, it's really important to communicate and set boundaries. Setting boundaries in terms of if they're interfering with you, letting them know how it's interfering with your day and how it's interfering with your work at the end of the day, and how perhaps working more independently on certain things would allow you to produce things in a quicker fashion or in a more, focused fashion, or your timelines or what. So showing them kind of these constant check-ins we're doing are actually taking away from the work that I'm meant to do. So, suggesting, can we reduce the check-ins or have a weekly meeting instead of daily meeting to do all of our updates instead of constantly disrupting the day for them. Planning together with micromanagers is really important versus saying like, okay, now we're gonna go to weekly meetings and I'll just give you the updates then. It's kind of sitting down with them and go, okay, let's come up with a plan together so that we can have these less frequent check-ins to allow more uninterrupted work time within my day. And you kind of come up with the plan together so they still feel like they're involved in it, but it's hand-holding boundary setting almost, if you will, because at the end of the day, you're setting that boundary with them of like the communication, but they feel involved in that process. And so it's going to be, I think, more sustainable when you're dealing with a micromanager. I also think too, if you're dealing with a micromanager, kind of taking that initiative of, micromanagers in my experience are very predictable. They're very predictable in terms of kind of the updates that they're going to constantly want or the check-ins and whatnot. And so you can be a little proactive to save yourself time or save yourself the headache of dealing with them. A great one I like to suggest is like shared project plans. And so having a shared project plan in a space where you can just go put updates in and then give them a place that, hey, if you're curious at all throughout the week or throughout the month of where we're at progress-wise, I'm going to update this document whenever new information is available. Feel free to go check in here. So you're removing that constant check-in with you and giving them a place that they can go and reference whatever they need to be updated on. I think too, when we're dealing with micromanagers, just holding a little bit of space for what stake they might be holding within that situation and realizing that sometimes micromanagers don't want to be micromanagers, but they have to be because they're dealing with someone above them who's constantly on their case about getting updates and staying integrated with teams, or there might be a pressure that you're not aware of that's causing them to have this behavior. Like I said, not everyone necessarily wakes up and chooses to be a micromanager. So just trying to understand a little bit more what else externally is going on that might be contributing to this. I think when we can try to understand a little bit more of the reasons behind or the motivation as to the behavior that they're displaying, it gives us a little bit more grace with people. It gives us a little bit more understanding of there's a reason that's contributing to this behavior, and not just because they're a bad person, if you will, or an annoying person or a toxic person or whatever you want to label it as. It's important just to, if there are external things that you can be made aware of, to just try to keep connected into them, because I don't know, I find it helpful when I'm able to look at things more through a human lens. I always think about Brenda. I think about Brenda and I think about there are so many things contributing to her behavior at work, and we see a lot of her tendencies to micromanage, but they are rooted in other issues or in other reasonings. Her inability to disconnect from work, and at work being the huge priority in her life, everything seems so heightened and everything seems so extra serious, and then it kind of trickles down to different team members because she's dealing with these things and then she's kind of projecting them onto different team members. And I always think about Brenda and I'm like, well, we've seen good parts of Brenda and then we see more challenging parts of Brenda, but I think the more we see Brenda, we start to hold more space for Brenda, the more we understand her. And so I would say, approach coworkers like that too. I think we're so multifaceted and there's so many different competing things within our life that cause us to be who we are. And so I always remind myself, this person didn't choose to wake up today with the intent to do things that make other people feel like crap or do things that make other people's day a lot more challenging. I mean, some people do, and they're the exception to the rule, I guess. Holding space to understand a little bit more about people tends to actually make me deal with these people on a day-to-day basis a little bit easier when I can hold space for them in like a human form. And this last one is my least favorite of them all, and I have zero tolerance for. It's bullies. Bullies in the workplace. I have run into many of these. I continue to run into them. I have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to bullies. I'm grateful now I'm in a position where I can pick and choose, my teams and who I work with and the clients that I take on. And if anyone kind of exemplifies any of traits of a bully, I don't work with them. If anyone wants to bully anyone on my team, that's great. You just lost us as a client. I have a zero tolerance policy with it. Bullies, they're aggressive, they're dominant, they crave power, they're exploitive, intimidating, negative, abusive. Like we all know the different traits of a bully. In the workplace, it's like a very specific kind of toxicity rooted in, I'll bet you a lot of issues that person has to kind of work out. Like I said earlier, you can't change other people. You can't make someone change or see what they're doing or who they are. Like if you were like, oh, bully, you're a bully, like they cannot see that unless they take the time to look inwardly, and oftentimes they're not putting the work in to address that. How to deal with them can be really challenging depending on your situation and depending on who the bully is. Like if your bully's a manager, that's a really challenging situation to be in because they potentially have power over your employment. When you are in a position of power, it's really, really important to call out that behavior. If you see it, when you see it, calling it out, acknowledging it, identify the issues of the behavior, identify how they impact the teams, the work, the projects, the environment, dynamics, and all of that. Keeping an eye open for bullies within the workplace. They can make people feel really isolated. They can make people feel like almost a shell of themselves. They can make the most extroverted person appear more shy because they're just kind of, recoiling a bit. Keeping an eye out for it and bringing it to someone's attention that can do something about it when that happens. I think, I look back and there's certain leaders that I would trust to or feel comfortable to go to that I don't feel like I would get in trouble for presenting this as an issue of, hey, so-and-so is being really, awful to so-and-so. And then I think it's important too to document things. So if you are someone that's receiving bullying in the workplace, first of all, I'm sorry that you have to go through that, but it's really important to document everything, write everything down, have a full folder or a inbox or something where you can just put all of those interactions with that person aside in the case that things do escalate. I think is really, really important. You want to document everything. If you are struggling with dealing with a bully in the workplace, when you're having meetings and whatnot, avoiding those one-on-one interactions and making sure that you have multiple people present in the space to see if maybe that deters some of their behavior, or trying to find ways to limit the one-on-one exposure with that person, I think is really important. If you are a workplace bully, get help, go to therapy, figure out your shit and stop putting it on everyone else. This is such a hard one because it makes me so mad because I know that it's way more common than it should be in the workplace to deal with this. And I've seen so many of these people, and it's hard because they're not going to change unless they choose to do that for themselves. And any short-term change because of someone telling them they can't do that, or, you know, being like, hey, this is the anti-bullying policy, like that's not sustainable because the root of the issue is within themselves. I know when you're getting bullied, it's really hard to remind yourselves that this is all about them and has nothing to do with you. They just chose you to project all of these insecurities and traumas and issues of their own onto, and it's an awful position to be in because you didn't do anything to deserve that. In this situation, it's very much how can you protect yourself and how can you protect your mental health, how can you protect your physical health, how can you make sure that you aren't out of a job because you speak up about something. It's really like on the defense mode, and kind of how can you deflect it as much as possible or remove yourself from their situation. I don't know if I have any like really strong, powerful advice to tell you about dealing with bullies in the workplace other than a lot of boundary setting. I hope that there's someone that you work with that you trust, that in good faith will do with that information what should be done with it. I hope that it can get rectified. And now we're just gonna rip through some, not like specific types of coworkers, but just some behavior that can be more challenging or toxic, if you will, to deal with within the workplace. And every time I say toxic, inside I go, like I cringe a bit because I'm like, toxic looks different for everyone. What you deem as toxic, what I deem as toxic could potentially be two different things. So I'm just going to list off a list of, you know, more commonly deemed things as toxic. The first one being passive aggressiveness. This one makes me chuckle because I feel like there's so much passive aggressiveness in the corporate world in general that I'm like, well, I don't even know if I find it toxic anymore. I just more find it comical because it's just the root of so much of the corporate world, I feel. But anyways, dealing with a lot of passive aggressiveness is just recognizing baited statements and not kind of biting onto that bait or overreacting to them. At the end of the day, I always remind myself, I'm like, it's business, it's not personal, rarely anything is in the working world, and so just let it go. Let it go. Choose your battles, Laura. Dealing with passive aggressiveness is kind of deciphering all the BS and figuring out what the root of the issue is, and then solving the root of the issue that they're, you know, really being passive aggressive about. There's always an issue beyond what that person says that's actually the root of the issue. I feel like it's just a big dance around a bush of their issue. You gotta find the bush, right? And you gotta attack the bush itself. So that's what I'd say for dealing with passive aggressiveness. Stealing credit, whew, this one really fires me up when people don't give proper credit where credit is due. I've seen it, oh gosh, I've seen it, where people will literally present your work and then claim it as their own. I've also seen it, oh my gosh, I will never forget, I was in this meeting and someone was presenting someone else's work like very clearly, and I'm a big believer in karma, like this'll be fun. The presentation was finished and they presented all the other person's work, and then people started asking very detailed questions. They couldn't answer it. They could not answer these questions, and I just sat there and I was like, you know who could answer those questions? The person who made that presentation. That was an interesting one to watch play out. That was a good reminder for me because I'm like, it's really frustrating when people steal your work and take credit for it, and I think it's important to give credit where credit's due, especially as a leader, but it speaks volumes about the people taking the credit for your work, and usually it's not sustainable long term. And I relate this back to being a content creator now. My work gets stolen all the time and reposted on different platforms, especially those like animation platforms. I get sent hundreds of videos a day, or 100 times a day I'll get videos of, oh, this animation thing stole your script and it's your voice. Like, it's the most frustrating thing ever, but here's the difference. Yeah, they can steal that and take credit for it, whatever. I have my brain. I can make 1,000 more videos like that. They can't, because they had to rely on someone else's creative idea and scripting in order to make their final product. That gives me sort of like a sense of peace of mind of kind of like, okay, this is long-term for me because I'm this root of source for this information and for this creativity. It gives me a little sense of peace there. That's how I get through it. It's really annoying though when I think about it. It fires me up. If there's an opportunity to take back that credit almost, or potentially invite yourself or connect with that person and say, hey, you know, great delivery on this information. Next time I would love to be included in the delivery of it or in the presentation of it, and see if you can kind of claim back that power or test the waters of how much they're really willing to collaborate. I think it just speaks a lot about the person taking credit for the work. Sometimes too, when people take credit for your work, while it's frustrating, don't make accusations necessarily. Have a conversation with them, because sometimes they might not have realized that they took your work. And I know that sounds crazy, but sometimes it just happens, or they got sent something from so-and-so and it just all got jumbled. They thought actually the person that did the work was even someone that wasn't you. So just kind of opening conversation to set things clear, I think is important. important. Instead of coming in guns blazing of like, you didn't give me credit for this work and blah, 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 like open up the conversation about it so that you can kind of understand their truth as well and how they got to it, and then figure out an appropriate way to react. I have in this list here, and actually Work Bestie wrote out the next bit for me. And he wrote down here, a characteristic of a toxic employee is being annoying. That's it, just being annoying. And then it proceeded to say, you know, remembering that annoying behavior to one person isn't necessarily annoying behavior to another person. And then proceeded to write a list of annoying behaviors. So I'm gonna read them off to you. Not muting background noises. Taking calls in open office areas. Oh, that one gets me. Using speakerphone in an open office. Chewing loudly. Disrupting meetings or calls. Dad. Dominating conversation to not let anyone else speak. Appearing to not pay attention. Has chronic technical issues. Repeatedly introducing themselves during the same gathering. Is that annoying? I'm gonna have to ask him about that one. Dirty workspaces or unkept workspaces. Misusing shared amenities like the kitchen, bathroom, different places in the office. That's just like disrespectful. Replying all. Sending unnecessary emails or messages which clutter your inbox. CCing unnecessary people. Grammatical errors and spelling. That is so Work Bestie core. If you ever spend some time with him, you realize how much he hates grammatical errors. Missing subject lines or meeting agendas. Incorrect name spelling. That's disrespectful. Talking over other people, arriving late. Initiating unnecessary meetings, using corporate jargon, bragging, coughing or sneezing without covering your mouth at your desk. Why are these giving me such a chuckle? Oh, that's so funny. I wish he was here right now. All right, so I'm just gonna leave you now with some general tips on how to deal with difficult coworkers to kind of summarize everything we've spoken about. I don't want you to roll your eyes, but I think, you know, having mindfulness or holding space for the fact that this person is a human is really important when we're dealing with annoying coworkers. I hate to assume, or I hate to look at someone's external behavior and just being like, that is exactly what they intended. That is who they are. There's usually so much going on below the surface that contributes to outward action that people might not even be aware of. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to dealing or reacting to coworkers. Boundary setting, I think that this one is just so important. When you're dealing with people in general, to just be able to set boundaries. And like I said in one of our previous episodes, you know, when we're setting boundaries, a boundary is in place to actually allow a certain relationship to succeed or to do better in the long term. Like setting a boundary isn't a negative thing. It's not saying no to things. It's creating space to set yourself up for success, to set yourself up to be successful in that working relationship that you have with someone. Kind of looking at what boundaries need to be set in order to have this situation be resolved or succeed is really, really important. Staying professional, I think, as much as we want to lead with emotion sometimes, and we can feel really strongly in different scenarios, especially with coworkers, it's important to take a step back and kind of not react when emotions are really, really high. And I know it sounds a little it takes away a little bit of the human element when you say, you know, remove emotion from it because we're emotional beings. But I think when we react from a place of emotion, it doesn't always achieve what we are looking to achieve. I like to kind of strip back emotion, or I also find too, when something's really, really triggering for me and it really, really sparks something in me and I feel so strongly emotionally towards it, I take note of it because that's something I probably need to sit with. That's gonna lead me to figure out something new about myself or something inside that maybe I need to work out, or a trigger that I hadn't really noticed that I had before. And so other people can really bring that out in you. Staying professional is really important because it's your brand, it's your reputation at the end of the day that's going to reflect in that response, and it's really important to keep that in mind when you're dealing with these situations and these people. Being positive, leading by example, I think especially a lot of these things can be very negative, and like I said earlier, you start to absorb the energy of people around you, and when you're surrounded by so much negativity, you kind of have to ask yourself, do you want to be part of that negativity itself, or do you want to be a little bit more positive, or potentially that positivity that impacts other people and starts to spread that energy out? So I would say as much as possible, just trying to stay positive within certain situations and remove the personal element from it. So this is work, this is not personal, even though it feels really personal right now. this is business, and I'm gonna remove that like personal feeling from it as much as I possibly can. And 4 is asking for help or communicating where required. So if you need some support of dealing with someone, if someone in their behavior is impacting you so much so that you are not able to show up and do your job effectively or do your job as successfully as you could if that was removed, ask for help, raise these concerns, talk to your manager, talk to people in leadership that you trust, do something about it, because at the end of the day, you want to show up and be able to do your job effectively. And if something is getting in the way of that, it needs to be identified. It should be identified, just like how you would identify it if there was an issue on your device or within a system that's a big bottleneck, and you'd identify those issues and come up with resolutions. We can do the same thing with people to an extent. I think it's important to have that open communication, to talk about things, to ask for support where needed, because if you don't do anything about the situation doesn't change. We can sit back and hope so much. Oh, I hope this person might leave the company, or, I won't have to deal with them long term, or maybe they'll change, but maybe they won't, and things won't get resolved. And you want to, at the end of the day, set yourself up for success. So identify what you need in order to do that. Well, that's all for today's Work Bestie Business discussion on dealing with more challenging coworkers. I appreciate you being here so dearly. Thank you so much for showing up and spending time with me today. We'll see you in the next video, Work Bestie. Toodaloo.